guest. He's a prolific author, an African-American historian who currently holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African-American Studies at the University of Houston. I believe the latest book is The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1885. It can be a challenge to keep up with the latest titles. And if I'm wrong, he will of course correct me. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me. And a slight amendment, 1800 to 1865.
Oh, what did I say?
85.
Oh, 65. My mistake. Thank you, sir. I told y'all he would correct me. 1800 to 1865 is the time span of the capital of slavery, Washington, D.C. So, Professor Horne, help me understand some of this. I want to say it was back in July. President Trump gave Putin 50 days for a peace agreement to be reached. And if not, oh man, there are going to be catastrophic penalties to be paid. And then he says, you know what? Oh, well, after he said that, what does Putin do? Sends missiles into Ukraine. Then Donald Trump says, you know what? I'm sick of this. I'm tired of this. I'm giving you 2 weeks. And what does Putin do? Sends missiles into Ukraine. And then they announced the summit. And at the summit, oh, we're going to have a peace deal. Then shortly before that, you know what? This is really more of a listening session. And what does Putin do? Sends more missiles into Ukraine. Do you see a pattern here, Dr. Gerald Horne?
Well, I think that what we're seeing is the inevitable results of erratic policymaking on the part of the U.S. president. He calls it a weave when he bobs and weaves and acts in an inconsistent, erratic fashion. He thinks that it keeps adversaries and potential adversaries alike off balance. But what it basically reflects is a certain kind of strategic incoherence that is, quite frankly, going to lead this country over the cliff if we're not careful. I'm thinking about the recent sanctions against India. Now, we all know, or we thought we knew, that India was essential to the anti-China policy, given the rather tense relationships over the decades between India and China. But with the sanctions against India, because India is buying oil from Russia, it's driven India straight into the arms of China. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi was just in New Delhi. The Prime Minister Modi is headed to China at the end of the month. And then, of course, I think that the ultimate result of the events of the past few days may signal the eclipse of the European Union. That is to say, that spectacle in the White House just a few days ago, when Mr. Zelensky showed up with this bodyguard of 7 to 8 European leaders, all breaking their schedules, Prime Minister Starmer, President Macron, Chancellor Merz, Ursula von der Leyen, Mark Rutte, Prime Minister Meloni of Italy, etc. It really reflects the fact that the EU has basically lost its mojo. In the Wall Street Journal this morning, there's a story about that where they quote Jamie Dimon, the top U.S. banker, as saying that Europe is losing. And I might also remind the audience that according to John Bolton, recall that his house in Maryland was just raided.
Right.
He was a former national security advisor under Mr. Trump and then wrote a tell-all memoir blasting Mr. Trump, and now the FBI has invaded his office and his home. But anyway, he says that Mr. Trump feels that the European Union was a chief adversary of the United States of America. And Mr. Trump, if I read him correctly, does not necessarily want to assist an adversary. That is to say, as J.D. Vance suggested, if the Europeans want to buy U.S. weapons and send them to Kiev, well, they're quite capable of doing so. But then he backtracked on that, on Fox and Friends, by suggesting that the United States might provide air cover for some sort of European troops that enter Ukraine. So I'm not sure where that stands. And in any case, what has not received sufficient attention, except in the Financial Times of London, is that there are U.S. corporations that are benefiting handsomely from trade deals with Russia. I'm thinking of Weatherford and SLB, formerly Schlumberger, both oil supply companies, who are heavily invested in Russia, for example. And it makes me wonder if Mr. Trump plans to impose what Lindsey Graham, the senator from South Carolina, calls bone-crushing sanctions on Russia. Will they also be imposed on U.S. corporations? Somehow I doubt it.
Two questions to get out of this. One is, we keep, from the Western narrative, we continue to hear this so-called analysis, maybe I'll just call it attempted explanations, as no, everybody seems to be amazed when Putin says the same things time and time again. It's as though folks are hearing for the first time, I'm not giving up territory. That ship has sailed. Here are my demands. No NATO in Ukraine. No security guarantee. No, you're not putting troops on the ground. No. They act as though they haven't heard this before. But from the time that Putin and Biden met in Geneva, and Biden and Putin said to Biden, I'm giving you my security demands in writing, and I expect a response from you in writing. This man has not wavered, has not altered, has not changed. So they just keep acting as though, oh, he just decided that he wants to do these things. Am I off base here, Dr. Horne?
Well, I think that in the North Atlantic community, there's been an overestimation of their potency and strength.
Thank you.
They thought that when the Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991, that it would be the end of Russia. But that has not taken place because in some ways, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's like a corporation being forced to disgorge itself of various subsidiaries that were draining dollars from the central coffers. That is to say, the subsidies that were previously going to Moldova and to Georgia and to Kazakhstan and to Azerbaijan and Armenia in particular were not going from Moscow to these outlying regions. And so that allowed Russia then to be able to husband more of its resources. And with the ascension of Mr. Putin approximately a quarter of a century ago, you've obviously had a turnaround. And so that's a difficult pill to swallow because the Europeans for centuries now have been fighting a losing battle. That is to say, after the Western Europeans got fat on the African slave trade and the dismantling of polities in the Americas and genocide against the indigenous, they were a major power globally, but in their backyard in Europe, Russia was still a leading power, if not the leading power. After all, today it has a population about twice the size of number two, Germany, 160 to a million or so. And of course, is better endowed with natural resources, be it gold, diamonds, oil, natural gas, platinum, etc. And so these are very bitter pills to swallow. Hence that spectacle in the White House just a few days ago with the European leaders meeting with Mr. Trump and being embarrassed when in the middle of the meeting, Mr. Trump picks up the phone and dials Mr. Putin and briefs him about what's going on, as the European leaders have to cool their heels. That's how you treat vassals.
In fact, I got two other quick questions on the other side. This is such a, well, I'm not going to use that language. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Wilmer Leon here. The last word is show. Dr. Gerald Horne is my guest. Inside the Issues is where you are, Sirius XM 126 Urban View. Right now, this is Hank Mobley from Soul Station. I tell you, during the 1960s, one of the most prolific tenor recorders on Blue Note. 1960, this is This I Dig of You. Hank Mobley, tenor, Wynton Kelly, piano, Mr. PC, Paul Chambers, bass, Art Blakey on drums. Keep it locked right here, Sirius XM 126 Urban View. 19 past the hour. Dr. Wilmer Leon here, inside the issue. Uh, Hank Mobley could just flat out swing. Oh, my. Wynton Kelly right there on piano. But my God, that brother could flat out swing. That's This I Dig of You. Hank Mobley from Soul Station, 1960, Blue Note. Dr. Gerald Horne is my guest. And I want to wrap up this whole issue with the Friday fiasco with two quick questions. One, your thoughts when Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov got off his plane with the CCCP sweater on. Uh, you know, they were coming to what was formerly um, Soviet Union territory, and folks may not know that Russia sold Alaska to the United States, and he gets off the plane with his CCCP sweater. I thought that was a very clear message. Donald, you are in trouble today.
Well, assuredly, the North Atlantic press represented it as trolling on the part of Mr. Lavrov, but I think a more accurate descriptor is that we've gone from the Red Scare to the Thread Scare. That is to say, when a mere sweatshirt can cause so much discontent and consternation in the North Atlantic community, it's a clear sign of they're losing their mojo. They've lost a foot off their fastball, and inevitable decline is the ultimate result.
And to that decline, going back to the Biden administration and the United States blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline. On my podcast, Connecting the Dots, on Thursday, shameless plug, on Thursday, I had economist Professor Richard Wolff. And then Friday, I had economist Dr. Radhika Desai. And on Thursday, Richard said that, again, starting with the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline, the United States blowing it up, that Europe is in decline. And I asked Dr. Desai the same question, and she agreed. And knowing that the U.S. blew up the pipeline, knowing that Germany was the hub for distribution of cheap Russian oil and natural gas throughout Europe, and that was the basis upon which so much of European industry is based. Um, is Europe in decline, and why are its leaders following the United States down this rabbit hole?
It's certainly in decline. Let me refresh your recollection about today's Wall Street Journal, the aforementioned article,
Mm-hmm.
which goes into some length and detail about that. Likewise, recently in the Financial Times of London, there was a quite telling article that I'm sure captured the eye of the investing class. That is to say, that in light of the challenge from Chinese electric vehicles, range anxiety has been reduced with regard to these Chinese EVs, such as BYD, which you can't buy in the United States right now, although you
Mm-hmm.
can buy them all over the world for the most part. But given that challenge, that's putting enormous pressure on Volkswagen, Renault, and other European auto manufacturers, and not to mention the tariffs coming from the other side, from the United States of America. And so what's happening now is that the investing class worldwide, they're shorting European auto manufacturers. That is to say, they're betting on their decline. They're betting that they will be plunged into a death spiral. And I think that that is a kind of metaphor for the European Union. Now, we know that historically, France has tried to redirect the EU towards what Mr. Macron calls strategic autonomy. It goes back to Charles de Gaulle, the leader in the 1960s, who you may recall, 8 years before Nixon and the United States recognized China, France had recognized China. But alas, France is not the locomotive of the European Union. That dubious title goes to the Federal Republic of Germany. And they, of course, are occupied territory. That is to say, US troops continue to occupy Germany and continue to influence the political direction of that major European nation which is one of the reasons, I'm afraid to say, why the Nazi curious Alternative for Germany party is now, according to polls, the #1 party
Mm-hmm.
in this leading capitalist nation.
Shifting gears, in June, Donald Trump sent federalized troops into Los Angeles, Marines, National Guard. Still can't really figure out why. Now we've got Secretary of Defense Hegseth authorizing the troops that have been sent to Washington, D.C. now to carry weapons. And I thought this was a kind of natural follow on uh, to to um, to your book, The Capital of Slavery, Washington D.C., 1800 to 1865. Dr. Gerald Horne, what's going on here?
What's going on is that I'm afraid to say that the denizens of the District of Columbia are basically enmeshed, whether they know it or not, in an experiment. It's a sort of neo-fascist experiment that is treating the residents like they're guinea pigs. Washington, D.C., due to its peculiar structure and history, is a soft target. Recall that when Mr. Trump sent National Guards officials and personnel into Los Angeles, that the governor, who has presidential aspirations, objected. 2 U.S. senators objected. Yet Washington, D.C., because of its peculiar history, does not have a governor. It has a mayor who has to bend the knee to Congress, which controls the purse strings, does not have 2 U.S. senators, has one member of the House with circumscribed voting rights, the presently enfeebled Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton. And then, of course, there is this long-term ambition of the right wing to engage in what might be called a kind of racial cleansing of Washington, because it's been seen as somewhat anomalous for a white supremacist state to have a Black majority capital. This has knock-on effects when it comes to political trials. Recall that just a few days ago, when Attorney General Pam Bondi, or Scam Blondie, as he's sometimes referred to, impaneled a grand jury to investigate the so-called Russiagate scandal, that it was not impaneled in the district because majority Black juries are not seen as politically reliable. And that is to say, not necessarily prone to dance to the tune of the GOP. So it was impaneled in South Florida, which brings me to the flip side of this neo-fascist experiment, which is that we're also in the midst of a counter-revolution, which has an inglorious history from the founding of this so-called republic in the 18th century through the overthrow of Reconstruction, post-U.S. Civil War, for example, that era of democratic promise that was drenched in blood by the rise of lynching and the Ku Klux Klan. And now the overthrow of the gains of the 1960s signaled when the New York Times suggested a few days ago that the ultimate ambition of Mr. Trump is to put the former U.S. President Barack Obama in prison. He's already gone after perhaps the leading or the most powerful Black woman in the country, Lisa Cook of the Federal Reserve, a comrade of Jay Powell of the central bank. He wants her to resign or be fired, for example. And so I'm afraid to say that many of our intellectuals and leaders and organizations, somehow they did not anticipate this moment. I think that they accepted this sort of liberal cant that the United States was a country that was making progress because of the power of the Constitution, et cetera, and did not look at the underlying socio and economic forces that would lead us to this perilous and dangerous moment.
You mentioned guinea pig. That's interesting because yesterday I used the word, or I made up the word guinea pigization of Washington, D.C. Um, you've got, he goes into L.A., you've got Karen Bass, African American woman, as the mayor. He goes into D.C. with Muriel Bowser, African American woman, as the mayor. He threatens Oakland with Barbara Lee, African American woman, as the mayor, and now he's also threatening Chicago. Is this the guinea pigization for the test run of the laboratory test of martial law?
Well, that may be in the offing. What's curious is that Washington, D.C., as we speak, is one of the most heavily surveilled cities on planet Earth. After all, there are 17 intelligence agencies that are sitting there. There are all manner of police, including park police, not to
Mm-hmm.
mention the Metropolitan Police Department and other auxiliary forces. The FBI, which is headquartered in Washington, many of their agents have been dispatched to the streets. And the U.S. attorney there, the Trump comrade Jeanine Pirro, has already suggested that they're going to be throwing the book at anyone who's detained. And that is a signal, I'm afraid to say, to our Black youth. And it's also a signal to the immigrant population. They are being routed as we speak, which is going to have repercussions and ramifications with regard to construction, for example, with regard to the local economy, for example, because if they are removed, their dollars will not be spent in the district, they'll be spent elsewhere. So Mr. Trump, whether he knows it or not, is creating a major catastrophe. And it's unclear how we will dig ourselves out of this hole in which we find ourselves.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Wilmer Leon here. Inside the Issues is where you are, Sirius XM 126 Urban View. Dr. Gerald Horne is my guest, and his latest book is The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865. You've got a new book on the horizon. The title, Dr. Horne?
The Counter-Revolution of 1893, the Hawaii Coup and the Roots of U.S. Imperialism, the Asia-Pacific Basin.
Folks, the hits just keep on coming. That's all I can tell you, Dr. Gerald Horne. I'm going to tell you another hit. This I Dig of You, Hank Mobley. So this thing just flat out swings. 1960, you got Hank Mobley on tenor, Wynton Kelly on piano, Mr. PC, Paul Chambers on bass, and Art Blakey on drums. Do yourselves a favor. Keep it locked right here. Sirius XM 126 Urban View. Past the hour. Dr. Wilmer Leon here, and folks, that's This I Dig of You, Hank Mobley from Soul Station. And if right now your head ain't bobbing and your foot ain't tapping, dial 911 because you're lapsing into a coma. Because if you ain't swinging off of this, you can't swing. It end of point, period, full stop. Okay. Dr. Gerald Horne is my guest, and Dr. Horne, we know that Zohran Mamdani, a Muslim Democratic Socialist, won the Democratic Party primary. He's now the Democratic Party nominee, running for mayor in New York. And the Democrat Party elite have run from him like the building's on fire, which I guess some might say it is. And there's an interesting piece in the New York Times out of power. Well, before I say that, let me say this, that I have been saying ever since he won the nomination that this is going to be the outcome of this election in New York is a bellwether of what the Democrats can expect to be up against if they don't dramatically become a party that stands for something and can clearly articulate what they stand for. And now there's a piece in the New York Times. The Democratic Party faces a voter registration crisis. The party is bleeding support beyond the ballot box, a new analysis shows. What say you, Dr. Gerald Horne?
Well, certainly the Mamdani victory in the Democratic primary a few months ago was a watershed, a democratic socialist, socialist, of course, being equivalent to a four-letter word in U.S. vocabulary, triumphing over the Nepo baby, speaking of Andrew Cuomo, son of a former governor, Mario Cuomo, a former governor himself, ran out of office on a rail because he unveiled himself as being a sex pest. And then there is the incumbent, Eric Adams, up to his eyeballs in corruption, the latest scandal.
Mm-hmm.
At a rally, one of his aides handed to a reporter uh, hard cash in a bag of potato chips, believe it or not. One of his other top aides
Wait a
is
minute, wait a
the,
minute. Putting a new definition on Frito Bandito. Anyway, go
I,
ahead.
I
Go,
guess so.
go ahead.
Another of his aides, apparently uh, involved in corruption. Supposedly, she got a role in the movie Godfather of Harlem and in exchange gave out favors from her position in City Hall. And then to top it all off, the leading Democrats in the state, Governor Hochul, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Speaker in waiting Hakeem Jeffries, Gregory Meeks of Southeast Queens, the ranking Democrat on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, a leading member of the Congressional Black Caucus, all thus far have failed to endorse the Democratic nominee for mayor, who is ahead in the polls. Are they going to be running some sort of guerrilla warfare against a mayor Mamdani? All signs point in that direction, which is obviously self-sabotage and self-defeating. And it would be one thing if it were could just confine to Gotham, the leading metropolis in this country, but a few hundred miles or about 1,000 miles or so west in the state of Minnesota, you have the Minneapolis Mamdani, Omar Fatah, whose roots are in Somalia, who at the recent party, Democratic former Labor Party, as it's called out there in the Midwest, their recent convention, he was crowned to be the nominee to be mayor of Minneapolis, but then they took it back because of a backlash, because his politics mirror those of Mr. Mamdani. So the Democratic Party needs to come to grips with the reality. That is to say, are they going to be a big tent party, or are they just going to depend upon socialist voters to troop to the polls to vote for centrists, but should not challenge for power? I think that if it's the latter, that's not sustainable.
In well, I can't remember the month, but after the 2024 election, James Carville was asked, "Well, what should the Democrats do now?" And he said, "Oh, we don't need to do anything." And he has since changed that position, but he did say at the time, "Oh, we don't need to change anything. We just need to sit back and allow this thing to implode." And then Nancy Pelosi was asked the same question. What do the Democrats need to change? And she was told, her response was, we don't need to change anything. Um, no, they need to change a whole lot. They need to actually, first of all, before you can change something, you got to stand for something to change. And I still trying to figure out if I were to ask the head of the DNC, give me three sentences to tell me what your party represents, I don't think he could do it.
Well, part of the problem is the Republicans are going in a different direction, shall we say. There's a big article in the New York Times about how the far right, some might call them neo Nazis, are not necessarily in the streets because they feel that Mr. Trump is enacting their agenda, for example. In other words, as Republicans are doubling down on right wing extremism, you would think that the threat of fascism would cause many centrists in the Democratic Party to at least consider the possibility of a broad anti fascist front, not unlike that which brought the fascists to their knees in 1945. But because of this disturbing reality, that many of these centrists, they would prefer to hold on to power unchallenged rather than effectuate a compromise with the Social Democrats, which could at least have the possibility of thwarting the neo fascists. But right now, we're on a path to peril.
Switching gears, Orinoco Tribune, which I strongly suggest folks, if you're trying to find a website, a news source, Orinoco Tribune is, I think, a very good place. Um, Netanyahu rejects Gaza deal, reviews plans to occupy Gaza City. He has decided not to respond to the proposal recently approved by Hamas, despite efforts by mediators to push forward a deal. Steve Witkoff, the U.S. Middle East envoy, has allegedly distanced himself from the formula he initially supported, with reports noting he no longer trusts the mediators. Um, I have a somewhat of a problem with that, Dr. Horne, no longer trusting the mediators, as though the Zionist colony was ever negotiating in good faith to begin with. I've asked the question ad nauseum. How can you negotiate with someone whose stated position is your annihilation from the planet? I don't know how you negotiate with that, Dr. Horne.
Well, obviously, what we're faced with is a slow motion genocide in Gaza. The authorities, international authorities, have already adjudged that a famine is gripping the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands who reside there. There are diabolical and despicable plans in motion to deport a goodly number of the Palestinians,
Mm-hmm.
ethnic cleansing, if you like, perhaps to South Sudan, perhaps to Uganda, which has just signed on to receive those that Washington decides need to be ousted from the United States of America. So why not those who are ousted from historic Palestine? At the same
Wait a
time,
minute, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. Isn't there an irony in the discussion of deporting Palestinians to Uganda when, as I recall, when they were trying to, when Theodore Herzl and the crew were trying to figure out where the where the Israeli state would be, Uganda was one of the places considered.
exactly, many other places as well, which obviously calls into question the historical mythology
Correct.
that this the Jewish people were returning to their ancestral homeland. That was the historic Palestine was one of a number of possible places to relocate to.
Yeah, I just find that to me, I find that to be a nauseating irony. But anyway, go ahead, Gerald.
No, I mean, I think that part of the problem, of course, is that by all accounts, we should expect a resumption of the so-called 12-day war of June 2025. That is to say, the conflict between Israel and Iran. In fact, in order to understand Mr. Trump's meeting in Alaska and his attempt to come to a apparent settlement in Ukraine, you have to understand that with the influence of the Zionist billionaires in the White House, Washington is now engaged in overstretch. That is to say, how many wars can it support, particularly when the big enchilada, speaking of the People's Republic of China, looms menacingly. We already know that there is a 7-year waiting list to get these Patriot missile interceptors, which did not necessarily acquit themselves well in any case when Iran was shooting missiles into the heart of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And if this 12-day war, in fact, does resume, I think that the Iranians are really going to take the gloves off. And the world easily could tip into a kind of World War III if we're not careful.
I'm glad that you framed it in that manner. A couple of points. One, I've been saying for a while, particularly as the stories have been developing about Netanyahu deciding that he's going full bore in Gaza. I've been saying that people need to pay attention to, with this story, it's not so much what's being reported, it's what's not being reported. And what I mean by that is Israel can't do this without the United States. There's no, I don't, we had been lulled into this false sense of belief about the superiority of the IDF. We've been told for years that, oh man, all they do is traverse the world, kick ass, and take names. And man, when they go into when they go into Gaza, oh man, and what do we find out? They were fought to a standstill, which is why we are where we are, because they could not carry the load. And now Netanyahu says what? He sent out. He's drafting 60,000 more forces, giving them a couple of weeks to report. Um, but the United States involvement in this is not being discussed. This could very well be Netanyahu's march to Armageddon.
Well, part of the problem is the structure and mission of the Israeli military. They're only structured to engage in what might be called shock and awe
Mm-hmm.
wars, such as you saw on the first day or so of the so-called 12-day war, when they sent James Bond-like agents into Tehran and assassinated military leaders, assassinated nuclear scientists, but they had shot their wad after that. And the problem is that if they try to resume another version of the June War, inevitably they'll have to rely upon U.S. imperialism. But the problem is, amongst others, that the anti-Netanyahu bloc is splintering, such as it is.
Mm-hmm.
They've assuredly been holding massive demonstrations in the heart of Israel, but many, too numerous to count, are fleeing across the Mediterranean to Cyprus, driving up real estate prices, to Europe, to Australia, to Brooklyn, for example. And that leaves a hard core of maniacal right wingers who are actually to the right of Mr. Netanyahu. And that does not necessarily bode well for international peace and security.
And if the United States and Israel foolishly decide to pick up where they left off as it relates to the 12-day conflict with Iran, this most recent Azerbaijan Armenia corridor, the Donald Trump highway or whatever that, however they're referring to this thing, um, it seems as though the United States is trying to create some space or another angle for attack. Dr. Horne.
Well, in considering that Armenia-Azerbaijan deal, you also have to factor that into the first point on our agenda. That is to say, another reason for Mr. Trump to move towards a settlement in Ukraine is
Mm-hmm.
because Armenia and Azerbaijan are former Soviet republics, not far distant from Russian territory, to put it mildly, and initiating escapades there to try to weaken and destabilize Russia would be more cost effective than this Ukraine debacle that is currently unfolding.
Man, okay. So, switching gears to one more region of the world where the United States just wants to smoke at the gas station. Again, going back to Orinoco Tribune, China, Iran condemn U.S. empire's military threats against Venezuela. The Chinese government has expressed its full support for Venezuela and rejected the actions and intentions of the U.S. empire against the South American country. Um, I was saying to somebody yesterday, it's interesting how the U.S. conflict with China has basically been taken off the front pages as Ukraine continues to escalate and looking at what's going on with Gaza. But now you've got the United States sending uh, battleships steaming towards Venezuela. It's as though they can't find a fight they don't want to start. Um, Dr. Horne?
Well, it's quite troubling and quite disturbing, this dispatching of flotilla off the coast of Venezuela. Mr. Trump in the past has made no secret of the fact that he feels that Venezuelan oil should be under the jurisdiction of the United States of America. There is a $50 million bounty on the head of President Maduro in Caracas. Recall that that's larger than the bounty that was put on the head of the late Osama bin Laden after he was accused of being the mastermind behind the attack on New York and Washington, September 11, 2001. And as U.S. imperialism glances at the global correlation of forces, they see that in neighboring Bolivia, that the movement towards socialism, which had been in power for a few decades, just suffered a stinging defeat at the polls. Trump allies are coming to power in La Paz. Marco Rubio of Cuban ancestry has cracked down on the dispatching of Cuban doctors to Brazil. And of course, Brazil is in the crosshairs because of its understandable attempt to prosecute former Trump ally Mr. Bolsonaro, the former president, for seeking to engage in a coup just a year or two ago when the current president Lula was sworn into office. So, with that correlation of forces, Mr. Trump apparently feels that it'll not be that difficult to knock off Mr. Maduro. And I have to say, I was struck by an article in this morning's New York Times that suggested that this might just be a pressure tactic to compel Mr. Maduro to accept more Venezuelans who were deported from the United States of America. But Mr. Maduro welcomed Venezuelans deported from El Salvador most recently. So I was scratching my head about that allegation. And in any case, it's something else to be worried about.
And you mentioned the $50 million bounty on the head of democratically elected Venezuelan President Maduro. That's 40 million more than the CIA had put on the head of Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, who was the representative of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the founder of the Islamic State, who is now the leader, the U.S. anointed leader in Syria, head chopper extraordinaire. I mean, he makes Mohammed Bonesaw look like a Cub Scout. Um, the logic here is not logical, Dr. Horne.
Well, as I said at the top, I think that Mr. Trump sees it as an advantage to be inconsistent, to be erratic. He feels that it keeps adversaries off balance. Obviously, he subscribes to that moth eaten nostrum, that consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. Mr. Trump, if he is anything, is inconsistent. But as we used to say in the streets of St. Louis, I think Mr. Trump and US imperialism generally are cruising for a bruising because they're taking on too many adversaries
Mm-hmm.
and shedding too many erstwhile allies.
And at their own uh, at their own hand. I mean, these are. It's not as though there are all of these conflicts around the world and the United States is the moral arbiter and has to go in and squash. No, the United States in too many of these instances is starting the conflict or pouring gasoline on the conflict and then claiming to the American people, we have to take your tax dollars and go in here and stop the conflict that we started. They're shooting themselves in the foot, if not the head.
Well, I think that Mr. Maduro may have a nasty surprise for any U.S. troops who land on Venezuelan soil. I was struck by the reports and the photographs of militia
Mm-hmm.
being armed by the Caracas regime, not to mention the fact that I'm sure their comrades in Cuba will not see their brotherly comrades, speaking of Caracas, go down in flames without that particular eventuality being challenged. So, Mr. Trump, he says he wants a Nobel Peace Prize. He says that in his inauguration speech in January 2025 that he wants to settle conflicts more so than initiate conflicts. And I'm trying to figure out how what's happening off the shores of Venezuela fits into that equation.
As we get out, we've got just about 2 minutes left. What do you see, say, in the next 6 months as it relates to Ukraine? Because I don't see Vladimir Putin backing off of too much of his established position. Is it just business as usual?
Well, my crystal ball is in mothballs,
Oh, okay.
but I'll venture a guess that we can expect more of the same, continued Russian advance on the battlefield. I think that ultimately the Ukrainian regime, if it's not careful, will collapse. It was not coincidental that Mr. Trump, in a sense, was suing for peace in Alaska just a few days ago, because I think that any intelligent assessment would expose and reveal the fact that going into this conflict, Ukraine was disadvantaged.
It looks like Dr. Horne has locked up on us. So let me just say this as we move to get out, and that is, if in fact the Ukrainian government does collapse,
Deaths and defections,
oh,
is about former President Barack Obama said that Russia had escalatory dominance, and therefore the United States should not go there in terms of funding a debacle, but certainly Mr. Biden contravened that wisdom.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gerald Horne. Greatly, greatly appreciated. And just as we get out, I'll finish my statement. You locked up on us for a second, and that was, if in fact the Ukraine government does collapse, we could be in a much worse situation if those Ukrainian Nazi nationalists storm to power in Kiev. Folks, Dr. Wilmer Leon here, top of the hour. Keep it locked right here, Sirius XM 126 WB. Thanks, Gerald.
Good luck.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people.